Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending my presentation on diversity benchmarking, improving diversity and inclusion in library collections. So my name is Laina Kelly. You can reach me via email at lkelly@yrl.ab.ca. I'm a former teacher and a current librarian. I'm passionate about diversity in all areas, especially collections. And I really wanted to give a shout out to the International Journal of Information, Diversity and Inclusion, where I'm a senior editor. And if you like the content of this presentation, I would recommend that you check out our open access journal. We've been online for the past 3 years and have published a lot of great articles and other things in library sciences about diversity and inclusion, and generously hosted by the University of Toronto. So please have a look. So I thought I'd give you some background about Yellowhead Regional Library before we began this presentation. So the headquarters of Yellowhead Regional Library are in Spruce Grove, Alberta, which is about 20 minutes west of Edmonton. We provide regional library service to 44 public libraries and 43 school libraries across 3 divisions. So that includes services such as resource sharing, so our libraries share collections amongst the public libraries. We also provide cataloging, ordering from vendors, IT support and hardware purchasing, and then my department, which is consulting and training in all areas of librarianship and public service. I wanted to give some context about the regional systems in Alberta to give you an idea about the context in which the library that I will be talking about later on in the presentation exists. So Yellowhead Regional Library System, as you can see, is highlighted in yellow conveniently on this map, is a part of a consortium of 4 library systems called TRAC. So our TRAC partners are Peace Library System, Northern Lights Library System, and Marigold Library System. And within those 4 regions, we share collections, both e-collections and physical materials. So our members, our patrons in Yellowhead are able to place holds on books from all over the province. So that does affect collection development to a certain extent, as you can probably imagine. We're able to see what our partners have also bought and make decisions about community context based on that. So in this presentation, I'm going to go through a couple of different topics. The first one is going to be why perform a diversity benchmark. So I'm going to make an argument for why diversity is important in library collections. I'm going to take you through the process that I went through to conduct this diversity audit. I'll take you through a number of the evaluation sources that I consulted when coming up with my findings, which will be the next section. And then I'll give you a rundown of the recommendations I made for this public library. Unfortunately, since this is not a live webinar, you can always send me questions via email and I'm happy to answer them. So why should I worry about diversity and inclusion in a library's collection? It seems like very small potatoes compared to other issues libraries face. However, there are many reasons why I personally first became an English teacher and then a librarian. And that's because I believe that stories are powerful. I believe that stories have the power to transform people, to build empathy, to create commonality, and to change the world. I hope to model this to you during the presentation. So just to warn you, in addition to the statistical data that I will be presenting to you, there will be some anecdotal stories about the importance of this work. So to begin with, I wanted to read you a quote from literature professor Rudine Sims Bishop's essay, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. If you've done a lot of work in diversity and collections, I'm sure you've seen this referred to in a number of blogs and websites, but it is a really powerful essay, and I really encourage people to look it up if you're able. Here we go. Books are sometimes windows, offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. These windows are also sliding glass doors, and readers have only to walk through an imagination to become part of whatever world has been created or recreated by the author. When lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us, and in that reflection we can see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. Reading then becomes a means of self-affirmation, and readers often seek their mirrors in books. As I said, I recommend everyone read this entire essay, and not only because it is eloquently written and just a nice piece, but it really brought home the importance of this work to me. Every child should have access to books that act as mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, as should older readers as well. And in the subsequent slides, I will give you some real-world examples of situations where windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors come up, both in my personal life and in my teaching experience. So first, let's begin with mirrors. The examples I'm going to provide for you, many of them come from an essay article called Through the Sliding Glass Door, #Empower the Reader by Johnson, Koss, and Martinez. And if you want to read more about them, the citations are at the end of this presentation. So the first quote I'd like to share with you from this essay is about books as mirrors. Literature serves as a mirror when we see some facet of ourselves, physical, cultural, or emotional, reflected back. As we know, diversity encapsulates a lot of different areas of people's lives. So these physical, cultural, or emotional reflections can take a lot of different forms, and some or all of these reflections can be found in one book for a particular reader. Here's an example of a book acting as a mirror that I really wanted to share. Edmonton author Natasha Dean was visiting a Northern Alberta school on her Census Word Power tour, reading from one of her novels in the key of, or maybe it wasn't in the key of Niragani, but it was one of her novels, although that one was a fantastic one. I highly recommend it. Many of her novels include autobiographical elements about growing up or immigrating from Guyana as a child. So I'd like to read you this tweet. Natasha Dean's Census Word Power kids this week heard her story about moving to Canada from Guyana as a child. Her sometimes difficult experiences were very familiar themes to some of her listeners. One of them shared this note with their school librarian. I know how she felt about her skin color. So the second way that diverse books affect readers is as windows. So I think all of us here have used literature as a window. One of my favorite things to do when traveling is to read fiction written about the places I'm visiting, especially when it's written by people who are from there. When we read books that act as windows, we have the opportunity to get a glimpse into another person's life, sometimes people who are very different from us. So here's a quote from that same essay. When books function as windows, readers see people, experiences, or worlds removed from their own. So here's a personal example. I read the book Birdie a couple of years ago, and this was a real window for me into the life of a young Indigenous woman. Not sure how autobiographical it was for the author, but it certainly was a transporting experience, a learning experience, an exercise in building empathy. And I really enjoyed reading this book, even though it was quite a tough read. So I'm sure we can all think of dozens of examples of books as windows that we've enjoyed over the years. So the third point from Bishop's essay is books as sliding glass doors. So here's another quote from the Johnson, Koss, and Martinez paper. Books that serve as sliding glass doors invite readers to step through and into an experience that may change them. When a book is a sliding glass door, it offers not only a glimpse into another person's story, but changes the reader. The reader may gain a sense of empathy and may even be motivated to take action. So this is an example from the essay that I mentioned before, and not an Own Voices book, and somewhat a controversial book among Own Voices communities, but this is the example provided in the essay, and I wanted to share it because the student who this affected had some powerful words to share. So I'm going to quote from the Johnson, Koss, and Martinez paper here. Fifth grader Austin stepped through a sliding glass door when his class read and discussed R.J. Palacios' novel Wonder, the story of a boy with a facial disfigurement. In his reader response journal, Austin wrote, Yesterday when I was at the grocery store with my mom, I saw a man with no arm. I looked away and then I thought of Augie. I looked the man right in the eye and smiled. He smiled back. For Austin, the experience of reading Wonder helped him develop a sense of empathy. Reading books about people different than ourselves might be confusing at first. There might be words or situations we don't understand because they're outside of our experience or even outside of our language. But if we dig deep and try to understand, or if the author is very skilled, we develop empathy and compassion for people who are different than us. So I'm sure many people have seen this infographic before, and we know that the publishing world, depending on what is published in a year, can make it easier or more difficult to collect diverse books, especially books that reflect the communities we live in. If there aren't books available, it's hard for us to have them in our libraries. And I know many of the audience members for this presentation are in the publishing world, and I know that many of you are very committed to this, and it is a slow process. Books aren't published overnight. So we appreciate the work that you're doing, and it certainly is of interest to libraries. So this is US publishing statistics from the year 2018. There are small numbers of books featuring racially diverse characters. Hopefully this number will continue to grow as time goes on. And I like to point out some of the things in this infographic that have been captured so well. So if we look at the white child on the right-hand side, he has many mirrors reflecting back lots of different experiences to him. He can be an astronaut, he could be a superhero, he could be a wizard. And so he sees himself in a lot of different contexts in books. The second largest represented, I don't even know, racial group is animals or other. So there are more animals appearing as protagonists or characters in books than people of color. The next largest group is African American. So 10% of the books published in 2018 had an African American protagonist. Or character. I think this one is just characters. And you can see that the top left-hand corner of that girl's mirror is cracked, and that represents representations in publishing that are harmful or stereotypical or just incorrect. The next represented group is 7% Asian Pacific Islander or Asian Pacific American, and again, we can see some cracks in that mirror. Then we have 5%, so 170 books published in the US among children's picture books in 2018. 170 or 5% had a Latinx character. And then of all the books published in 2018, all the children's picture books, we have 23 books or 1% featuring American, Indian, or First Nations characters. So very small representation. Lots of opportunities for those cracks to obscure some authentic representation. An interesting aspect that I found to this infographic is that if you add up all the books with Black, Indigenous, or people of color in them, there's still less than the number of books published with animal protagonists, which is, you know, a sad comment, but hopefully changing. And hopefully when this 2019 infographic, this is released by the Cooperative Children's Book Center. So far it's been released for the past couple of years. Hopefully the 2019 and the 2020 infographics will have some more hopeful changes. The next really interesting piece of research I found was from BookNet Canada Research. They released a study called Demand for Diversity, a Survey of Canadian Readers. And I pulled out, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how so many of the resources out there around diversity we see come from the US. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll see the importance of using Canadian data when we're looking at Canadian readers. So this report was released in 2019. And one of the questions we ask ourselves as librarians is whether there is a demand for diverse books among Canadian readers. And this report suggests that yes, people are interested in reading about people who are different from them, specifically Canadian readers. Additionally, we learned that Canadians from underrepresented groups do seek out books that represent who they are too. So this survey, if you haven't read it, BookNet Canada surveyed 500 readers. 154 of those readers came from underrepresented groups. The majority of the respondents did not identify as being part of an underrepresented group. And just to remind everyone, an underrepresented group could be a visible minority, a person with a disability, a person from a sexual or gender minority, or religious minority. They surveyed Canadians who had read at least one book or listened to at least one audiobook in the past year. And half of all respondents purchased a book in the last year, or in the past year, and 43% borrowed a book from the library. So there are some library users represented in this survey as well. So here are some highlights. 45% of readers from underrepresented backgrounds seek out books that represent them. So that's almost half of readers from underrepresented backgrounds are looking to see a mirror in the books that they're choosing. 46% of all readers were interested in reading books by Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So they're looking for mirrors or windows or sliding glass doors to have a really immersive and different reading experience for themselves. 62% of all readers actively seek out books about diverse topics or experiences or by diverse authors. So over half of the readers surveyed were looking for that diversity. And 31% of all readers stated they would read more if they could access more diverse books. So based on all these things that I learned, the plan was to conduct a diversity benchmark. I had a couple of questions that I wanted to answer. Most of what I was reading about diversity audits was coming out of the US, and in particular, the work of librarian Karen Jensen. So these were my hypotheses going into this diversity benchmark. Do the diverse books being published reflect the US or the makeup of the US rather than Canada? We have very different populations, and I was really curious about that. In our library collections, what minority groups might we be missing? And this is a good question for the publishing industry as well. My third question was, how could our libraries improve? And my fourth question was, how could I help libraries learn to assess their collections? And obviously this presentation is part of that. So my process. This next part of the presentation will cover the steps involved in the benchmarking process. I'll go over the tools I used to analyze each book and how I recorded that information. So as I mentioned, the first step was to make a hypothesis. So my hypothesis was the diversity in rural collections reflects minority groups prevalent in America rather than Canada. I had a strong suspicion that this is what I was going to find. And I'll let you know by the end of this presentation whether I was correct or not. The second step was to identify the criteria that I was going to look at for this presentation. Different collections may require different criteria. For example, this project involved the young adult collection. If I were to look at an adult nonfiction collection, I would have to really carefully think about the process outlined in this diversity benchmark and think about how to change that a little bit. So there are a few reasons why I chose the young adult collection. There's lots of awareness in this area and lots of publishing changes coming out in this area. And it seems like a lot of diverse authors are writing for this collection. That might be my own bias looking at things on Twitter, but I feel like this whole movement kind of gained traction first there. So I thought maybe we would have the best chance of having a sampling of diverse books in this collection. So what aspects of the books are you going to look at when you examine a book? How will you decide whether it's diverse? Are you going to look at the author, whether it's an own voices author? Are you going to look at the minority groups that the protagonist belongs to, or characters in general? I decided to look at protagonists and authors, and I felt really strongly that if I was going to look at diverse books, I wanted the diverse characters to be the heroes of the story. And that's usually the character who the reader relates to. So it was really important to me that I looked at whether the protagonist was from a minority group and also the author. And I was able to separate out those two pieces. So books with minority protagonists written by non-own voices authors, and groups with minority protagonists written by own voices authors. So quickly, just in case there's some people in the audience who aren't aware of this, just wanted to go over the definition of own voices. Own voices is a movement that came about on Twitter and has now caught the attention of the book publishing industry. So if you are from that industry, you've probably heard of it. There are many benefits to using own voices in the classroom and in the and buying it for public library. The first is that historically and today, authors who are not own voices have difficulty writing books that don't fall into stereotypes, often because there aren't a lot of good resources written by that community because they haven't traditionally had the opportunities, the same opportunities to publish their works. And this is not to say that every book written from a non-owned voices perspective is poorly researched or contains stereotypes. It's hard for people to judge that if we are not from that group, right? As a reader, I often don't feel confident when I'm reading a book unless I'm choosing an own voices author. If it's not an own voices author, I take what's in the book with kind of a grain of salt. So the second reason why you would choose an own voices author is they'll bring sensitivity to a topic that often non-own voices authors simply can't. And on the next slide, I'll share an example with that. But to just review the definition, own voices is defined as creators who belong to a marginalized group writing about characters who are also part of that group. Own voices books challenge stereotypes brought about by poorly written representation, and they, as I mentioned, bring sensitivity and authenticity to tough topics. So, I'm going to share with you now my biggest teaching failure. My biggest failure as a teacher was using this book for Black History Month. I had in my class a Black student. She was the only one. There are other students in that class from different visible minority groups. But what happened is this was the book that the school had bought a whole class set for everybody to read, and it was the book that we read during Black History Month. End of story. This was a school tradition. So I pulled out this book. I hadn't read this book, I think maybe ever. And so I got my kids all set up and we started reading. And the first problem was that the N-word was used profusely throughout this book. And I think the author used it in a historical context, but it made me really uncomfortable having to explain to my students this word. And, you know, being in grade 5, they just were not mature enough to understand the implications of that word. So you can imagine what happened at recess with a bunch of immature grade 10 student or grade 5 students, 10-year-olds. You know, they started picking on this girl, and also the content of this book really started causing the students to see her in a different light, because it was really about oppression and slavery. And I just felt that it wasn't a great experience for her. So you know, the parent came in and asked if she could read any other book, and I just didn't have anything else to give her. And I felt I was very ignorant at the time, and I wasn't able to find something else for this child. And I truly, truly regret that. I wish I'd put in more effort and found a book that she could have enjoyed. And better yet, I wish I had brought this up to the administration and just said, this book is really not a great choice for today's day and age, right? So in this context, using an own voices author would have helped this student feel pride and ownership that this author is from your community. And if I had found a Black Canadian author to talk about this, I think, or to read during Black History Month, I think it would have just been an amazing experience for all my students. The fact is that this author, who is a white author, wrote this book with white students in mind, and we never had a problem using it until a Black parent, who I mentioned came in and talked to me, pointed it out to us. The perspective of a Black student reading this book was totally different. It was a harmful experience for her emotionally and socially. There are some amazing Black Canadian authors writing own voices books about the same topic. So instead of Underground to Canada, let's try these. This great book, Crossing to Freedom, Elijah of Buxton, I Came as a Stranger, or Black Women Who Dared. These are all Black Canadian authors writing about these topics in a sensitive way. But better yet, let's not use Black History Month as an excuse to teach Black history. Let's study Black authors and authors from other backgrounds at all times during the year. And during Black History Month, let's remind them of those great literary experiences we've had throughout the grades and throughout the years. And let's make this diversity a part of our entire classroom, curriculum, and library. So step 3 was for me to define diversity in the context of this project. This is a very tricky thing to do. Karen Jensen's webpage, at the time that she wrote about this, she was writing for Teen Librarian Toolbox. She had great suggestions about how to parse out diversity, how to what to look for, what does diversity mean? It doesn't just mean visible minorities. There's lots of different other kinds of diversity we want to look for too. So I defined diversity for the purposes of this benchmark as visible minorities, protagonists who or authors who are from visible minorities, religious minorities who are disabled or differently abled, who are from gender minorities, or who are from sexual minorities. Now, some of this language may not be as inclusive as people from these groups would like, and I apologize for that. The language I'm using in this presentation is from Statistics Canada, and I wanted to do that for the purposes of comparing apples to apples. So hopefully, if some of this language needs to change, it does so by the next census. But it is hard working with census data because they don't necessarily define things the way that groups wish to be defined. So in order to get ready to conduct this diversity benchmark, I used a product from our integrated library system called Simply Reports. I ran an item list report for this library's collection of young adult. In that report, I included the barcode of the book, the ISBN, the title, and the author. I'm using this reporting software, I'm able to pull those particular things out of the database. So I wanted the barcode so I could go look at the item record if I needed to. I wanted the ISBN so I could search it quickly in WorldCat or Amazon or on other types of websites. And then obviously the title and author so I could do a little bit of searching just in Google in general. I made an Excel spreadsheet and I made these things the following columns: visible minorities, Indigenous people, because Indigenous people are pulled out from visible minorities in Statistics Canada. They're not considered a visible minority in Canada. Religion, disabled or differently abled, gender identity, and sexual orientation. So here's an example of what my spreadsheet looked like. You can see I have all those columns. And one of the steps that Karen Jensen suggested that worked out really, really well was to, if that book fell under any of these categories, so a protagonist from any of these backgrounds, I would put a 1, and then I could sum it all up at the end. So you can see here I started out by identifying particular visible minorities, and this had to change as I continued working with Statistics Canada data, and I had to change some of these headings. But luckily, one of the best parts that she suggested was having a notes column. So when I came across a book that had a diverse protagonist or an own voices author, I made notes here in the column about the author's background or the particularities of the book, which was really helpful when I came to assess some of the data. Okay, so some of the tools I used to look at every single book. So that's literally what I did. I went down this spreadsheet and I looked at every single book. I did probably 200 books a day looking at this. And some of the authors you're going to know, like if there's a lot of Stephanie Meyer books in there, well, we know a little bit about her already. If there's a lot of James Patterson books in there, we know a little bit about him already. So I could go a little quickly with some of this. But some tools that were really helpful is I used my library subscription to Novelist, and I was able to look at the Own Voices tag on Novelist to quickly help me identify whether this was a book worth looking into more or not. Unfortunately, Novelist is not completely set up for a lot of Canadian published titles. So when I came across Canadian authors, either they weren't in Novelist or I would do a little bit more digging just to make sure the information was really correct. I looked at Amazon, sometimes the customer comments and the reviews in there. And then I would also just generally Google this information. I would look for author websites. I would look for Twitter pages. I would look at interviews. And that helped me gain a lot of information about these books and these authors. So here's just a quick example. Again, my spreadsheet. And here's just a record from Novelist. And you can see there was the Own Voices tag. So the final step in this whole process was evaluation. So after I looked at each book, it was time to aggregate totals and compare the collection with statistical data about the population from Statistics Canada and other sources if I couldn't find that data in Stats Canada. So before I give you kind of the rundown, I wanted to let you know a little bit about the town of Westlock. So Westlock was my wonderful test library for this project. They were great to work with. The director there was super interested in this information, and all the staff were really committed to receiving this information and learning from it and trying different things based on what I found for them. So I really want to give them some kudos here. The director is Lisa Old, and I'm very grateful that they allowed me to use their information. So Westlock is one of our larger libraries, which is why I chose it. It's also further removed from the city. So I wanted to get something that was or a library that was a little bit more rural, but still large enough to have a decent sized collection. So Westlock Public Libraries operate 3 outlets, one in the town of Westlock and 2 in the county of Westlock in Jarvie and Fawcett, which are 2 smaller towns nearby. I used Westlock's main branch young adult collection for this, and I also used stats from the town of Westlock as opposed to town and county in order to keep the data manageable, although this library would certainly have patrons from both the town and the surrounding county. So some highlights of Westlock. There's a Buddhist retreat center just outside the town that has this beautiful golden statue of Buddha. You can see up there I have a picture of the public library that's housed in a shared use building with some other community services. They have a tractor museum, and then they're just surrounded by really beautiful nature, lots of prairie, lots of farming, and some really beautiful historical buildings in the area. So this is a little taste of Westlock, which is the library whose collection I used for this. So some of the resources I consulted in preparation for this were Statistics Canada, as I mentioned. I looked at municipal, provincial, and federal data. I also looked at other Canada-wide research data, and I also looked at international or US research or census data when Canadian data could not be found. And I'll be really clear about that when we come across it. So brief highlights from Westlock's census profile. So this was a lot of the raw data, huge tables, lots of numbers. Their population as of the 2016 census was 5,101 people. 27% of the population was 65 and over. 80.7% of couples were married and 19.3% were living common law. Among families, 59% were without children and 41% were families with children. Major industries in this area include retail. So Westlock is kind of a retail hub for the surrounding county and industries there. Healthcare, again, they have the healthcare centers that serve the larger county. Accommodation and food services. One of the best resources I found on Stats Canada was actually its Focus on Geography series, which pulled out a lot of that data in a more usable way. So the first theme I looked at in Focus on Geography was Aboriginal peoples, which is the language that they use on Stats Canada. So in Westlock, some interesting findings. Métis people were the largest Aboriginal group in this area. There was also a large First Nations population too. Westlock is not particularly close to any reserves, so these are Métis people living off settlement and First Nations people living off reserve in the general town area. Unfortunately, this data does not break down by band or reserve, but you can glean some of that information by looking at Indigenous languages spoken if you wanted to parse it out that much. I didn't in this situation, but if you wanted to get more granular, you certainly could. The next Focus on Geography section I looked at was visible minorities. So this revealed that the largest visible minority populations in the town of Westlock were Filipino, South Asian, Black, and Chinese. And I'll give you some information later how that compares to the rest of Alberta. In terms of sexual orientation, the data that I was able to find was for both Canada and some data for Westlock. So 1.7% of Canadians aged 18 to 59 reported in 2019 that they considered themselves to be homosexual, gay, or lesbian. So as I said, this was from the Canadian Community Health Survey done in 2014. Language has changed a little bit since then, and our understanding of gender and sexual orientation is changing. So bear with me if some of these things are a little older school. 1.3% of Canadians in that same age group reported that they consider themselves to be bisexual. 4 to 10% of Canadian youth consider themselves to be homosexual or bisexual, and this is from the Portrait of Canadian Youth that was released in 2018. And as of the 2016 census, there were 5 same-sex couples living in Westlock at that time. So the next statistics I was looking for was gender identity. Now, I wrote much of this presentation last summer, and I'm not sure if more information has come out since then, but the best information I could find was from a report done by the Williams Institute called How Many Adults Identify as Transgender in the United States? I couldn't find any information for Canada. So 0.58% of the adult population in the US identify as transgender. As of this report, written in 2016, so conducted from surveys done before that. So I suspect this number is probably larger as people's awareness of transgender or gender identity grows, as people feel comfortable, as society feels it's acceptable for people to talk about their gender identity. I suspect this number will grow. So disability, this is from the Canadian Survey on Disability from 2017. So interesting here, youth aged 15 to 24, 13% of them had one or more disabilities. So that includes physical, cognitive, or mental health as well in that number. Mental health and learning disabilities are the most common disabilities among youth. More than 40% of all Canadians with disabilities have a severe or very severe disability. That was from that survey, the Canadian Survey on Disability in 2017. So the next data I looked at was religion. So this is quite old data. It's from the 2011 National Household Survey. At the time that I created this, I could not find more recent data. So 3.2% of all Canadians were Muslim, 1.4% were Sikh, 1.5% were Hindu, 1.1% were Buddhist, and 1% were Jewish. So you can see how that kind of plays out in a pie chart here. The large red section is Christian, and the large gray section is Canadians who identified as having no religion at all. Yeah. So on to my findings. So after I kind of built this profile of the community and gathered some statistical data about the population, I was able to compare the collection to Westlock, the community, Alberta as a whole, and Canada as a whole. Okay, so I put these on the same table just for purposes of having fewer slides. So Indigenous people and visible minorities in Westlock. The gray bar on this graph represents the percent of the total population of Westlock that are part of that who are Indigenous or part of a visible minority group, and the red represents the collection. So some highlights here. First Nations people, First Nations Inuit and Métis people comprised about 9% of the total population of Westlock and less than 1% of the collection, of the YA collection. Similarly, you can see a discrepancy here between South Asian, not a huge population in Westlock, but also very small representation in the collection. Chinese, same thing. Not huge representation in Westlock, very small representation in the collection. And then here's what was quite interesting. Black Canadians were a larger part of Westlock's visible minority population. These were people often who had immigrated from the Caribbean recently, and the collection of books with Black protagonists was quite a bit larger than the population. And I suspect, and actually I know from my findings, that this is representation of American authors who were whose books were part of this collection. So obviously that is a larger visible minority group in the US. So since a lot of our publishing and purchasing would come from the US, it makes sense that that group would be a little bit larger. And it's overrepresenting a group is not a bad thing at all. What was shocking here, the largest visible minority group in Westlock is Filipino. Not a single book by a Filipino author or with a Filipino protagonist. That was really shocking to me. Not surprised that Filipinos were the largest visible minority group. Shocked that I couldn't find any books or authors at all. And in fact, when I tried to look for Canadian Filipino authors, it was very, very hard to find them. I think I found 2 authors, one of whom had self-published. So these books would not be easy to get our hands on. I won't go through the rest of this data, but those were kind of the highlights there. And I did want to be clear about visible minorities in Stats Canada. There's 2 different ways that people can identify themselves in the Stats Canada survey. They can identify themselves as a visible minority. So that would have a lot to do with how they feel they are perceived by others, right? The other part of the statistics data you can look at is ethnicity. So these are people who, as far back as their grandfather's side, their grandparents identify their ethnicity. So obviously people can belong to multiple ethnicities. So take this number with a grain of salt. These are the people who identify themselves as visible minorities. Do their children necessarily identify as a visible minority? Quite possibly not. My husband's mother is Filipino, his father is white. And would he consider himself a visible minority? I'm not sure. You'd have to ask him about that. And a lot of it would depend on how he feels oriented towards different groups or how he feels that the world perceives him. So by having diverse books in our collection, we're serving not just visible minorities, but people who come from those different ethnic groups as well, possibly generations back, especially when we look at Black Canadians who've been in the country, for Black settlers who've been here for a very, very long time, who were part of the original settlement of this country, and Chinese Canadians, especially in Western Canada, who've been here as well for a very long time. So their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren may not identify as a visible minority anymore, but certainly these stories would provide some mirrors for them too. Okay, and again here I just put this information into a pie chart so you could kind of get a sense. And the biggest discrepancy you can see here is the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit books compared to the population of Westlock. That is quite a stark difference, and would be definitely something you'll see in my recommendations that comes up. So when we took this data and compared it to Alberta, percentage-wise, it was very interesting. So again, Alberta had just over 6% of the total population, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, and again, a very small part of the collection. When we look at Alberta as a whole, the largest visible minority group is South Asian, the second largest is Filipino, followed by Chinese, and then followed by Black. So here you can see what compared to Alberta, while there was overrepresentation of Black protagonists compared to the population in Westlock, it's not quite there for the population of Alberta. So some interesting decisions to be made on the part of the people doing collections in this library. I know this information was very, very revealing to them and hopefully is interesting to you too. So again, here I wanted to put in donut graphs so we could kind of see that when we're looking at the population of Alberta, almost 1/4 of the population identifies as a visible minority, and compared to the collection, quite small. So when we look at this data Canada-wide, we can see that Alberta actually has slightly more, we can see that Indigenous protagonists or Indigenous people are widely represented in the Canadian data, over 4%. But what's interesting is kind of how things parse out from there. So our largest visible minority group Canada-wide is South Asian, followed by Chinese, followed by Black, then Filipino. So, Canada or Alberta has a slightly different makeup, as does Western Canada. So I really encourage publishers when they're looking to acquire books. I'm not sure if, we have some small publishers here out west, but to look at the country at where different groups are settling across our country, right? So if you've taught in an Alberta school, you will know that you will have a lot of Filipino students. And what books do we have to serve them, to make them feel proud and engaged about their culture? That's really where it hit home for me. So I just really wanted to bring that up to our audience and have that hit home. Same with South Asian. Very tricky to find some of those books, but there is more representation than there is for sure for Filipino authors. And again, so Canada-wide, we actually have a larger population of FNMI people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, than we do in Alberta, percentage-wise, right? But again, almost 1/4 of the population identifies as a visible minority. So again, just comparing that to the donut graph of books here. So sexual orientation, I just put into a donut graph because the difference was really stark, and I'm only looking here at Canadian data. So 10% of Canada's population identifies as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Of the books, very, very small percentage, 2.5% of the collection. So, and we can see here a slight skewing towards books with gay male protagonists. So the next section we're going to look at is gender identity. So this has been kind of a hot topic in society. And so of the books in this collection, 0.7% had a transgender or non-binary protagonist. So that's a pretty great start compared to the small data that we're seeing from the US. I'm sure this number will grow again as books get published and trends catch up with society. So that was one of the ones that was interesting, because it was very on par. The next area of diversity we looked at was disability. So 13% of Canadians have a disability. Less than 2.9% of the books in this collection had a protagonist with a disability. So that was quite a big difference. One of the biggest differences I've seen in numbers in this whole project. So I thought that was really interesting. And just to parse this out a little bit, only 16 books in the collection had characters with disabilities, or had a protagonist with disabilities. And, when we talk about diversity, we're also looking at intersectionality. So where do books have protagonists that cover or encapsulate more than one minority identity, right? So only one of these books had a protagonist that had a disability and was also a member of a racial minority. In terms of the disabilities represented, these are the ones that were represented: depression, brain injury, autism, ADHD, learning disability, deaf or hard of hearing, OCD, mental health unspecified, bipolar disorder, amputation, and schizophrenia. So yeah, it's interesting which disabilities end up in the books that we have in our collection and which ones don't, right? So interesting food for thought. So the next area we looked at was religion. So at the time of the 2011 National Household Survey, 67.3% of Canadians identified themselves as Christian. And, religion is an interesting thing in books because most of the time it is not specified. And in addition, this community of Westlock has a few nearby colonies and colony schools who love the Christian fiction books, especially in the YA category. So it makes sense that there would be some more in this collection. And then the only other religions represented were Muslim and Jewish. It's not surprising to me, but certainly an interesting observation, and wouldn't be bad to collect some more of these books to bring some more windows into your collection. So as I mentioned before, we were going to talk a little bit about intersectionality. So 7 books in the whole collection featured intersectional protagonists. So those are protagonists from more than one minority group. So 2 books had protagonists who were both a visible minority and a religious minority. 1 book had an Indigenous protagonist who also had a disability, and 4 books had a protagonist with a visible minority who was also a gender or sexual minority. The next thing I wanted to look at was own voices. So of all the diverse books in the collection, over half were by own voices authors, which was great news. Now, where it was interesting, it was how it broke down in the chart on the right-hand side. So I think it's a little small for you guys, but I'll go over it a little bit. And I know some of my labels got cut off, but we'll talk about this. So of all the diverse books in the collection, the visible books with a protagonist with a visible minority and visible minority author, most of those books were from own voices authors, which is great. And that's where a lot of the own voices traction has come up, is with authors from visible minorities. Indigenous authors, more Indigenous authors than not, which was also good, but overall, very small amount of books in general. This was an area that shocked me. Of the books with protagonists who were disabled or differently abled, the overwhelming majority of those books were not own voices books. And there's lots of talk on Twitter and in blogs about why this is a really big problem, because it really can affect the way that we treat disabled or differently abled people, and would be great to get more own voices books from that community. From sexual minorities, almost 50-50, more own voices than non-own voices, so that was great. Transgender and non-binary, it was 50-50, so would be great to have more own voices in that book, in that area. And then interestingly, for religious minority, more non-own voices than own voices. So this included books where it was like a white Christian author writing a Muslim character. Interesting choice. I obviously didn't read the book and I'm not an expert in that, but just interesting to observe and maybe something to look at in moving forward in collection. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about popularity and demand, because we saw BookNet Canada's research on demand for diversity and is there demand, right? So when I ran the stats last November, these were among our top 10 most popular items within our entire track consortium: The Poet X and The Hate You Give. The Hate You Give, especially being made into a movie, people were really excited. The kids are really excited to read books that are being made into films. So makes sense that that was one of them. And then The Poet X has just been a real hit with the teens that we work with. And, it's just a great book. So is there popularity and demand? Yes. And both of these authors are Black American authors. So, even though they don't fulfill that Canadian context, there is popularity and demand. Would love to see some Canadian authors up here eventually. So 6 recommendations emerged from this research. As you've been following along, you may be able to predict what my recommendations for this library is going to be. But first of all, I really wanted to emphasize that there's no shame and blame in these recommendations. As I mentioned, Westlock Library was kind enough to let me use their collection. Overall, the collection contained a variety of perspectives and recently published diverse books, which is a testament to the library's collection development practices. This has obviously been on their mind. I know that diversity is and has been a conscious issue with the staff doing collection development at this library. And for those of you who have been less aware or less able to regularly purchase books, you may see that your numbers are a little lower. But I do like to remind librarians that when we are looking at our collection, we're not just looking at things that we've bought recently. We're at the mercy of what people have bought for the past 20 years. And especially with our rural libraries that don't have a large amount of money for collections, you can't just wipe out a whole collection and replace it. These things take time, and it's a constant process. So no shame, no blame, no guilt, as Senator Patty Laboucan-Benson likes to say. So recommendation number 1 was Indigenous protagonists. So I really recommended for this library that they increase Indigenous representation in their collection, and that they really, really look for own voices libraries. Sometimes you can't find representation of Indigenous groups that are particular in your area. It's okay to buy from other Indigenous groups too. Debbie Reese on her website has some great examples of how there are some commonalities among that Indigenous experience that she's really appreciated, even when she's reading books from other, what they would refer to in the US as tribal nations. I really recommend Googling before you buy, and having a look at Debbie Reese's website, American Indians and Children's Literature. She does review some Canadian literature there too, but even just having read a couple of her things on there, it gave me a lot of pause when I'm looking at books by Indigenous authors or books with Indigenous protagonists by non-Indigenous authors. It gave me some great things to look for. To be fair, my assessment of this collection did not look at graphic novels, and that is where a lot of YA Indigenous publishing is happening. And this library does have a graphic novel collection, so a lot of those books may have ended up there. I really wanted to highlight this book, This Place, 150 Years Retold. It's a great read for high school students. And if you're an Albertan reading this, you can also read this in our Prairie ebook Indigenous collection online for free. So here's a little summary. Explore the past 150 years through the eyes of Indigenous creators in this groundbreaking graphic novel anthology. Beautifully illustrated, these stories are an emotional and enlightening journey through Indigenous wonderworks, psychic battles, and time travel. See how Indigenous peoples have survived a post-apocalyptic world since contact. So my second recommendation was to increase the number of books with disabled or differently abled protagonists, and as before, more own voices as if possible. This was a very cute book that I found when I was looking for new releases. Great intersectional book because we have some characters who are both visible minorities and from religious minorities. Both the protagonists in this book are Muslim. And then also we have a protagonist who's been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, so some disability representation there too. And I believe Canadian author, can't remember 100%, but we can Google this. So this is the book Love from A to Z by S.K. Ali. My third recommendation was for better representation of visible minorities. So more books with Black Canadian, Filipino, Chinese, and South Asian protagonists. More own voices, Canadian perspectives, if possible. And there are lots of perspectives to consider. New immigrants, first, second, and third generation or more. It's important to think of the historical contributions of these groups to modern Canadian society, but also representing their presence and impact in modern Canadian society. So not just books about underground to Canada, how Black slaves came to Canada. That's not the only representation we want to see. US publishers are good too. Don't use a lack of Canadian content as a reason not to buy, but certainly the publishers who are listening to this is a call to arms for you, and we'd love to see what you guys will be offering the next few years. So I wanted to highlight this book. This is not a Canadian author, but this is a Filipino author, Randy Rebay. The book is called Patron Saints of Nothing, and I wanted to just tell a quick story if I could. So my husband is not a big reader, but when he gets into a book, he really gets into a book. So I picked up this book last summer and I gave it to him. And I said, why don't you read this and let me know what you think? Like, do you think it's a good book or not? So he started reading it. And at the beginning, he was like, oh, he doesn't read a lot of YA, so it was not really his thing. But, he kept reading and he said, Laina, he goes, do you remember when we went to Manila? Like, we went through the airport, like in this scene. And he read me the scene and I was like, yeah, I remember that. That was, really cool. And then he kept reading and he goes, Laina, there's a word in here that the mother keeps calling her son. And he's like, I didn't even realize that was a word. I just thought it was something my mom said. And he's like, this is the first time I've ever seen it written down in a book. So that was really cool for him. And so he kept reading and reading and reading. And by the end, he closed that book and he said, this was an excellent book. We have to buy a copy. So we ended up buying a copy, and it is an excellent book. So, for now, this is what I'm recommending to schools and people who are working with a lot of Filipino students in their context. Would love to see a Canadian Filipino author. I'm dying to see that, especially a Filipino Canadian YA author. So recommendation number 4, sexual minorities. So more books with lesbian and bisexual protagonists, for sure. Gay protagonists as well, but own voices if possible. They're generally underrepresented, but lesbian people more so are more underrepresented in these things. So a great book here, The Love and Lies of Roxana Ali by Sabina Khan. So recently released book. If you're looking for a great YA book to recommend to some of your students or to some of the teens in your libraries, this is a good one. So recommendation number 5 was Intersectional Experiences. Books featuring protagonists who belong to more than one minority group. Oops, sorry. And I found a great example of Canadian literature for this. So this book is called For Today I Am a Boy, and it's about a Chinese boy who grows up knowing that he is transgender, and the difficulties he experiences, and the way things change for him as he accepts the gender he wishes to be, the gender he's always been. So this book, as I said, Canadian book, I was very happy to see many libraries and track have a copy of this. So if we want to buy these things, especially by Canadian authors. So please, more. My last recommendation was regular progress. So make buying diverse books a regular part of collection development. Make a conscious effort to buy those books and a commitment to buy a certain amount. Don't stop buying high quality books from minority groups outside your community. Those are still great to have. We don't know where people are going to go in this world, and it's great for them to learn about all different kinds of minority groups, not just the ones in their community, although I feel that should be kind of the minimum that is represented. If you are not a part of a minority group yourself, you will have to make a conscious effort to find these books. You're going to have to read a lot. You're going to have to look at a lot of reviews and a lot of blogs, but it will be worth it because you will learn a lot about the books that you're buying and be able to make really great reader's advisory recommendations. And don't be too hard on yourself when you're making collection developments. We are at the mercy of what we can buy and what's being published in a year. And as I mentioned before, we are at the mercy of past collection development decisions. All we can do is move forward from where we are now and make some different decisions. Great resource here. We need diverse books. I also recommend, if you're interested in learning more about this, we recorded a webinar here at Yellowhead a couple weeks ago, going over some acquisitions tools that have some great diverse books lists on there. And if you want to be directed towards that, just send me an email. So our big takeaways, or the takeaways I hope that you get from this presentation, are the following parting thoughts. The books on your shelf make a statement to your community. Representation matters. Seeing yourself or seeing oneself reflected in stories is a good thing. Seeing our neighbors, friends, and family and our fellow citizens reflected in books matters. Think about how minority groups are represented in the books we can access. Some big things to look for are, as I've mentioned before, are all my books with Black protagonists about slavery? Are all my books with Jewish protagonists about the Holocaust? These are important stories, but they can't be the only stories that we're presenting to our communities. Are all my LGBTQ books coming out stories? Do all my books with Indigenous people feature them in a strictly historical setting? Or do some of my books also show Indigenous protagonists in modern day settings? Good representation is about having a variety of experiences, including people from minority groups having sci-fi and fantasy adventures, solving mysteries, and experiencing romance. Doing some good Google searching will help you discover some harmful tropes in representation. And be aware that not all representation is good representation, but by using Own Voices books, we can help avoid some of those harmful and stereotypical representations, allowing all of us to see people within a minority group, allowing all of us to build understanding of others, not based on stereotypes, and allowing people within a minority group to see mirrors of themselves. And there is no maximum quota for diverse books. There's no point at which we stop and say, there, my collection is diverse enough. Buy diverse books as they are released. Build intentionally, but also buy books that excite readers, like The Hate You Give. If that is coming out as a movie, buy that book. Why not, right? If a minority is overrepresented in your collection, it's not a bad thing. The more we see others represented, the more normalized it will become in our daily experience. It also takes repeated exposure to understand aspects of other types of storytelling, especially as they may be different culturally. So we have trouble sometimes identifying these things because we've come to expect stereotypes and not authenticity, which is why looking at those sources is a really, really important factor. And finally, a well-rounded and diverse collection is a continuous journey. So as I mentioned, there's no end point at which we have a diverse enough collection. It's something that we commit to in all of our collection practices for the rest of our careers. So thank you so much for listening to my webinar, and I just really wanted to have this slide up to thank the following colleagues and friends who either helped me directly research this presentation or helped me as I tried to formulate the guiding thoughts and methods behind this presentation. And in some cases, permission to use some of the examples in this story. Much appreciated, but I do want to make it very clear that any mistakes, errors, or omissions in this presentation are mine alone. And thank you to my audience for listening. And with that, I'll leave it at my sources page. And if you want to see any of these in a larger font, please just let me know and I can send you my sources. Thanks for listening, everyone, and please take care.